Have you ever just stopped and wondered how all of the world's languages are related? Well, today we're going to dive deep into the evolving science of language families. It's a story that, believe it or not, connects all of us in some really surprising ways. So let me ask you a question right off the bat. What could English, Spanish, and Hindi possibly have in common? I mean, on the surface, not a whole lot, right? They sound completely different, they use different alphabets, and they're spoken on opposite sides of the planet. Well, the answer's pretty amazing. It turns out there's this deep, hidden family connection. All three of those languages, and hundreds of others, are all descendants of one single common ancestor that was spoken thousands and thousands of years ago. They're all part of one enormous family. To even start to wrap our heads around this, linguists use this really powerful metaphor, the family tree. It helps us visualize how languages split apart and change over these huge spans of time. So, what exactly is a language family? Well, it's a group of languages that all grew out of a single shared ancestor. And we call that ancestor a proto-language. The proto part is key because in most cases, we have zero written records of it. It's vanished. Linguists literally have to reconstruct it piece by piece, like detectives at a crime scene. Now, here's the really cool part, how they actually uncover these connections. They're not just looking for words that kind of sound alike by coincidence, and they're not looking for words that one language just borrowed from another, like how English grabbed the word sushi. Nope. They're hunting for deep, systematic patterns that are basically the linguistic equivalent of DNA evidence. Okay, take the word for father. It's a perfect example. In English, it's father. In Latin, it was pater, and in ancient Sanskrit, it was pitar. You see that pattern? The English F sound lines up perfectly with a P sound in the other two. That is not an accident. It's like a genetic fingerprint, proving they all share a common ancestor in the big Indo-European family. So how did we first start figuring all this stuff out? Well, it all started with a kind of old-school linguistic detective work. This whole field was called Comparative Philology, and its entire mission was to compare languages, prove they were related, and then try to reverse engineer what their common ancestor, that proto-language, might have actually sounded like. Pretty ambitious, right? And these early philologists, they had a specific toolkit. First, you identify the cognates, those related words like father and pater. Then you find those regular sound correspondences, like the F to P shift we just saw. From there, you can start to piece together the ancestral word. And, super important, you have to be really careful to rule out any similarities that are just from borrowing or pure random chance. And there's always a but in science, this early approach, as groundbreaking as it was, had some serious blind spots. Over time, people started finding some pretty major cracks in its foundation. The first big issue was how they did their work. They had this laser focus on ancient written texts. And for those early researchers, that mostly meant the prestigious languages, like classical Latin and ancient Greek. Now, why was that such a problem? Well, think about it. A written text can't tell you how people actually spoke. It doesn't capture pronunciation or local dialects, so you get this huge bias toward a few elite languages just because they had famous literature, while ignoring thousands of living, spoken languages that held just as many clues. It was kind of like trying to understand biology by only studying fossils and never looking at living animals. And this total reliance on texts leads directly to the second problem. The actual sounds of speech, the phonetics, were often treated like they were just secondary to the words on the page. This is a massive deal because sound change is the engine of language evolution. It's how languages change. By not focusing on phonetics, they were missing the absolute strongest evidence for proving languages were related. It's just too easy to get fooled by a weird spelling and think it's some ancient feature when you aren't paying attention to how it was actually said out loud. And the third crack in the foundation was this really rigid and ultimately totally unrealistic idea. The assumption that once languages split from each other, they just evolve in their own little bubbles, completely isolated. I mean, that's just not how the world works, is it? Related languages often stay in close contact. People trade, they fight, they intermarry, and that means their languages are borrowing words and features from each other constantly. That simple, clean tree model was just way too neat for the messy, complicated reality of human history. But these problems didn't actually destroy the field. Not at all. Instead, they forced it to evolve into something much more powerful and much more accurate. So, comparative philology didn't just vanish, it transformed. It became the modern science we call historical linguistics, and it incorporated all the things it had been missing:
phonetics, the reality of language contact, and tons of data from living spoken languages.
This led to a totally new way of thinking. The old tree model just shows languages splitting apart, but the more modern wave model, it shows that changes can also spread like ripples in a pond across a whole group of languages just because they're neighbors. It gives us a much more dynamic and realistic picture.
And this transition was a really well-documented shift in the history of science. For a long time, comparative philology was the main way of doing things, but as our understanding grew, it eventually had to make way for these newer, more comprehensive approaches right around the turn of the 20th century.
So, what's the big takeaway? What does this all mean for how we see the story of human language today?
The ultimate takeaway is that the history of our languages isn't a simple branching tree. It's so much more complex. It's like a living web, where branches don't just split apart, they also grow back together, they get intertwined, and they influence each other all the time.
And really, this whole story is a perfect example of science working exactly like it should. It's not about having all the answers at once. It's a process. It's about proposing ideas, testing them, finding their limits, correcting them, and slowly building a more accurate and nuanced understanding of the world. Which leaves us with a final, really fascinating question. As our tools and our understanding keep getting better, what other hidden stories about our migrations, our innovations, and our shared human past are just sitting there, waiting to be unlocked inside the very words we speak every single day?